Let me go ahead and introduce Diane. Diane is the owner of D.H. Leonard Consulting, which is based in Clayton, New York. She's an experienced grant professional and speaks on the topic of grant writing and grants management quite frequently and consults with nonprofit organizations of all sizes. Her firm was formed in 2006 and has raised more than $5 million in funds for its clients. And, of course, you can imagine her firm offers quite a number of services which are mentioned in her bio on the classroom page, so I don't need to get into those things. But, oftentimes our best instructors are consultants, and they rise above the crowd by virtue of being very knowledgeable in a field and also having the get up and go to step up and teach these kinds of sessions. So we really like that and appreciate that very much. And Diane has professional grant-related experience as a program officer for a statewide public foundation and then as foundation and grants coordinator for a major voluntary health organization in a large metropolitan area. And, of course, she's a member of the Grant Professionals Association, which was until very recently known as the American Association of Grant Professionals, which is a wonderful segue for me to mention that this session is, as with all grant writing or grantsmanship topics, contributed to the Charity University Network by Grant Professionals Association. And we really appreciate working with GPA because we know that when a session is contributed to the network, it's coming from a highly respected professional association of grant writers. So, and any organization that would have me as a member, however, is a little bit suspect. But setting that aside, I'm a proud member of GPA myself. Okay, and with that somewhat strange introduction, I hope you'll forgive it, Diane. I'm going to turn the class over to you.
All right, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I know, GPA, right? But we're glad to have you as part of it, Steve, for sure. So today I'm going to cover an overview of foundation and grants fundraising, and definitely, jump in with any questions. I really don't want to be the one speaking for the full 90 minutes, although I will if I have to, but want to be sure that what we're talking about meets your needs as well as participants. So go ahead and interrupt with any questions at any point. Today what I'd like to cover is, first, what is a foundation? What are some of the different types of foundations? How to research foundations? And then, slide error on my part. We're also going to talk about the grant writing process as well as common pieces in an application document. So moving on, we've already covered, Steve gave me a very nice introduction that talks about some of my background and why it is then that as a member of the GPA that I've selected to make a presentation and give you some more information on foundations. So grants are always, they're such a buzzword, and foundations are as well in terms of when a nonprofit is looking at a hard economic time like what we're going through now, to say, well, we need grants. We need lots of grants, and boards kind of latch on to that as kind of where they could raise some more revenue and what could be the answer to any revenue problems. Well, so when they're talking about grants, organizations could mean a number of different things. Could be governmental, could be foundation-based. So what we're going to talk about today is what does that mean when you're looking for foundation fundraising and revenues through a foundation. So a foundation is a non-governmental, nonprofit organization. They have funds that are managed by their own trustees or board of directors. It was established to maintain or aid activities that are focused on the common welfare, and they're primarily making grants to other nonprofit organizations. So very broad, but really the big thing here is non-governmental and nonprofit. There's two main types of foundations. There's private foundations and public foundations. And so before I get into the definitions, because these next slides are pretty much they're definition-based overviews, why does it matter what type of foundation you're going for? That's the question I'd ask in my head. It's important to know what type of foundation you're asking money for or money from, so that you know what sort of information they should have available to the public that you could be researching, and as an applicant should know before you approach them, and also so that you understand where their money source is coming from and how that affects where their money is likely to go. So with that being said, so of the first two categories, so private foundations, within that category there's three different types of foundations: independent, company-sponsored, and operating foundations. So independent foundations are private foundations whose primary function are making grants. Their assets are derived from an individual or family gift, typically. So this is where you'd find a lot of people look at family foundations. Family foundations are part of this category as an independent foundation. Independent foundations are the most prevalent type of private foundation. It's almost 90% of foundations. I talked about family foundations being a subcategory of independent foundations, so they're not actually their own legal designation. One of the things about independent foundations is that because they have such a narrow base of support where their assets come from, they're subject to specific laws that are intended to make sure that they're actually serving the public good in their activities. So if it's just one little family, the Diane Leonard family, that's giving all the assets, that's why the IRS has so many rules about these independent foundations, to make sure that it's not existing for the benefit of me. And that's all theoretical because sadly I don't have my own foundation yet. So then another category there in foundations are company-sponsored foundations. So company-sponsored foundations have assets that are derived from a profit-making company or corporation. Their purpose is to make grants on a broad basis, but usually with regard to the community that they operate in or the business interests of the company. Legally, they're different than contribution programs that are administered by the corporation. So one of the things that can happen is a lot of companies will put their profits, a certain percentage, as annual gifts to the foundation. But what can happen is that depending on their years and as profits ebb and flow, the company can augment those assets in order to make grants without having to cut back or maybe if they want to expand. So they have some flexibility, but it's usually just their annual gifts that they keep those foundation assets whole. So the other thing about company-sponsored foundation is that, like I said, we'll talk about it again in a second, but there's definitely a difference between company-sponsored foundations and corporate giving programs. And the big difference is that company-sponsored foundations have to publicly disclose their distributions and their grants, whereas a corporate direct giving program does not. We'll talk about that more in a second, though. The next category of foundation is an operating foundation. So an operating foundation is a private fund or endowment whose primary purpose is to operate research or programs that have been defined and determined by the governing body or their charter. This is similar to other independent foundations. It still is in the category where their assets are usually coming from a small group of donors or individuals. And instead, though, of taking those assets and turning them into grants for other nonprofits, they're taking those assets and distributing them on an annual basis to support their own program. Are there any questions about private foundations?
Nothing here, thank you.
We're good.
Did you have a question?
Nope, not me. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So then we'll move on to public foundations. Public foundations are comprised of community foundations, corporate giving programs, and public charities. The biggest one that you'll normally see when you think about public foundations is definitely community foundations. Community foundations are foundations where their funds are derived from many donors rather than a single source or a small group of donors. So in my case here in our community, we have the Northern New York Community Foundation, so that draws from 3 local counties, and all the individuals in those counties are donors to make up this larger community foundation. Community foundations primarily make grants in support of broad public needs. So they're really focused on small communities or regions in terms of what the needs are, doing needs assessments and things. So this is definitely, like I said, the best known category and most frequently seen in terms of public foundations. And they're almost always then geographically defined in terms of where their money is eligible to be given based on their board of directors restrictions. So then we'll move on to corporate giving programs. So this is the other arm then to how corporations can give their money. So where we talked about the company-sponsored foundation, on the other side you have corporate giving programs. So the grant-making apparatus exists within the company and is administered by corporate personnel, but is not a standalone foundation. And so what happens is the corporate giving program is not required to file their grants with the IRS, and so it's not public. So when you go searching for, say, example, on the foundation directory, you're not going to find a required listing of all the different corporate giving programs. So that makes them a little bit difficult sometimes to figure out whether or not you're within their scope, except for if you're looking at, what their geographic scope is in terms of company operations. But so something just a little different about them. And public charities then are also known as public foundations. These are foundations that are looking to redistribute funds that have been raised primarily from the public at large. A little bit different than a community foundation because it's not necessarily so geographically restricted. What happens is that the funds are raised usually through a fundraising campaign. Such an example would be some of the statewide women's foundations are public charities. So they have one common goal and they have a very large base that they're drawing from in terms of their donations. So then beyond the private and public foundations, the most common other form of giving in terms of foundations is a donor-advised fund. A donor-advised fund is held by a public charity. The donor or a committee appointed by the donor is the one usually directing the giving to the different charitable organizations. After a donor passes away or after a donor's family is no longer involved, then there usually is an order set out with that public charity for how it will be continued. So in that case, you'd usually see a committee or an advisor. The donor-advised funds are often, then you'll see them administered by community foundations, federated giving programs, or other public charities like we just talked about. So donor-advised funds can be fantastic as revenue sources, but they can also be tricky to break into in the sense of receiving your first grant. So it really depends on where the fund is held, for how it's managed, and what kind of access you can have to the staff or the committee that make the decisions. And so it's important to research them to find out whether or not they have an open RFP process, whether it's a closed process, what their annual size is, if they'll even accept unsolicited proposals. So lots of different options in terms of how they give their money and what really your best approach would be. So that's something to keep in mind, that sometimes they can be an untapped resource in terms of how diversified your foundation revenue is. But it definitely can take a little bit of relationship building with staff and committees. So here I've just described all the different types of foundations that there are. And then on the other side, you have the government funding in terms of when people talk about grants, what are they thinking about, either foundations or they're thinking about government. So we're not going to really get into government funding today. It's a huge, huge source of income for U.S.-based nonprofits. You can talk about government contracts, reimbursements, and grants. We could spend way more than 90 minutes talking about the money available through grants.gov, or some of the other organizations in the federal government still have different sites. Department of Education is one that doesn't always use grants.gov. But really, that's a very different level of, you're looking at very different grant applications, a different level of detail, very specific forms, and a different approach to narratives than when we're talking about all the other foundations that I just gave the definitions for. So that's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about the government funding, except for to say the big portal is grants.gov. If you haven't already registered or gone through looked at any of their funding databases, how you can search through them, the different ways to do advanced searches, it's definitely something to look at, but I'd rather focus on the other foundations today. Questions at this point about the multitude of foundations that exist that give money?
No, it's all making sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
well, that's good. Let me know if it's not.
Yeah, that was a very good flyover. It really was.
Yeah, lots of definitions. But like I said, I think really it's important to understand what the different types of foundations are that you're asking, because it can really change your approach. And so then that kind of segues into researching foundations. So there's lots of different ways that you can research foundations. There's paid funding databases. There's GuideStar, where for free you can have a subscription and be able to look at any foundations, $9.90 for usually the last 3 years that has been filed. There's the free way to look at then just if the foundation actually has a website. Perhaps on their website they put up their annual reports or newsletters. A lot of foundations now have e-newsletters where they're announcing RFPs or exciting new initiatives that they're starting. All these are key so that you can understand who it is that you're asking for the money from. And I just can't emphasize enough how important the research is. The funder that you're asking is really going to then do some research on you. They're going to spend a significant amount of time reading through your proposal. If they don't know much about your organization, reading your organizational capacity statements, maybe asking around in the community, trying to learn more about you to see if you would be able to do a great job with their funding to carry out your project and therefore further their mission. So if you think about how much time they're about to invest in you in researching whether or not it's a good fit, take the writing time aside that you would put in for any foundation and think about how much research you should put in to see whether or not they would be a good match for you, whether or not your missions are going to match, and if you're really going to be able to further both their goal and your goal at the same time.
Diane, I have a question, if
yes.
I may. What are your particular favorite funding databases that you might use in your work? I think it might be helpful to have some specifics if you have them at hand. If not, we can move on. But just curious. Yeah,
I think I've tried a whole host of them. There's a long list of databases that you can pay for. Foundation Directory, I think NOSA. The list of all the paid ones escapes me at the moment. But I'll say this. I tend to come back to Foundation Directory because I think that their searchability is very easy in terms of the different checkboxes that they've added for how you can search by funding category, by geographic focus. Whether or not they'll accept applications or not is probably one of the biggest things. There's a checkbox that when you put in all your search criteria, then you can say, exclude funders that don't accept applications. Because
now is that oops, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Is there a website URL that you can refer to for anyone interested in looking at that site? Or
is that the Foundation Center online you're talking about, Diane?
The Foundation Directory online, yes.
But it's at Foundation.
But it's through Foundation Center.
So what is that? FoundationCenter.org.
No, let's see. The Foundation
Forgotten.
Directory online is, that's a long web email. If I type it into chat, can everybody see it or no?
Yes. If you select broadcast to all as the recipient at the very bottom there in the drop-down box.
That's brilliant. Here we go. Thank you. There we go. So that's the link, and I didn't want to try and read that out.
I should read it out loud only because those who are hearing this in the recorded version won't see the chat. So that's http://FCONLINE.foundationcenter.org.
Oh, thank you, Steve.
That was helpful. Sure.
And again, the fees are definitely there, and I'm not in favor of proposing things to nonprofits that involve fees. And so that's part of why I normally don't call out databases. Like I said, I've tried a bunch. There's some that you can get free trials to. Those are great if you want to do a search. Just spend a few days on there, make the good use of your 30-day free trial. Some of them with professional subscriptions, you can end up getting a free year to a database as well. That's another nice perk. You'll start to see a lot of overlap between them because all of them really are basing their databases on the IRS filings.
Sure. If you're a member of GPA, I believe you get a free membership in Grant Station, or it's a discounted membership. I'm not sure which, but I recall seeing that.
Yeah, I think it is Grant Station, and I think it's still free.
I think that's right.
So if you join GPA or are a member, then you get free access to Grant Station. That's what I recall. That's good.
Yeah, definitely. Professional memberships aren't necessarily cheap anyway, and so to get that benefit instead of paying for a separate directory or database, definitely is a perk. I'll be honest, though, when I look at things, when I'm just looking for one foundation, I have a tendency to love using GuideStar and even just their free service because it's a quick way to get to 990s. And the key is you have to know where to look in a 990 for what you want to know. So it's they're not doing all the search features for you, but if you're just looking at like one or two foundations, especially if you don't have a paid subscription, to go on there, pull up the 990, know that if you go on to page 9, you can see whether or not they accept applications, and then if you scroll to the end of the PDF, you're going to get their full list of who they gave to for that year, rather than a lot of the databases shrink their list of recent giving to maybe their 10 biggest. And sometimes if you're looking at a smaller community organization that gives $1,000 to 100 organizations, you want to see the full breadth of what they give instead of just their top 10. So I love looking at 990s for that reason because it really gives you more detail than you'd ever want to know usually about the foundation, but it gives you that option to cull through it and then save it with the rest of your research and the rest of your writing for that foundation. So those are the different ways to research the foundations. I think it's important to talk about what are some of the key things that you should be looking for when you're doing this research via whatever avenue then that you choose to do. So you're looking for, when I say, does the funder demonstrate a real commitment to funding programs with your mission? So you're looking for mission match. Does your mission broadly match their mission? I'm not saying are they verbatim or even, that close, but as a broad strokes, are you both focused on the same geographic community, or are you both focused on bettering the lives of young children or of the elderly? What is it that makes you think that you're close? So if you look at their mission and you look at your mission and you're like, I'm not sure, I just don't see any connection, you might want to start thinking about it a little more, because when you write your narrative, if they read through it and they say, I don't get the connection, that's not going to be a good thing for anyone, because you want to spend your time writing wisely, and you also don't want to waste the foundation's time. So mission match is important. Key thing is whether or not the funder accepts applications. Like I said, some of the databases will let you filter them out. So when they say unsolicited, or that they don't want unsolicited proposals, unless you have a direct connection through a trustee or a staff person where you can have a conversation before submitting something, those really aren't going to be fruitful for you. They're usually closed list foundations where every year they give, $100,000 to the local university and $50,000 to the soup kitchen, and then they're done, or whatever it is that meets their particular focus as a foundation. So you also want to pay attention to whether or not the funder requires a specific application format or document. There are as many application cover sheets and requirements for character length or page limits as there are almost foundations. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but that you really have to pay attention to the specifics of what that foundation asks for. And the reason why is that they're asking for a reason. They're asking because that's how they have their review committee set up, or that's how they have it set up for if they're using like an online application system. They have a character limit because that's all that they want to share in their database won't hold more than 2,500 characters, whatever the case may be. So if you start trying to bend their application formats and requirements to better suit what you want to say, really you're kind of not playing by their rules, and that can often, it might seem silly, but they can often ding you on their scoring criteria because you're not following their rules. So, key piece, what application deadlines are there? You never, ever want to miss a deadline. Every once in a while you'll find a funder that will kind of extend a deadline for unusual circumstances, but you really don't want to have to ask for that because you're stepping off on the wrong foot with the funder. Everybody has circumstances that happen, but you want to try and set a deadline maybe internally that's a week or 2 weeks before the actual deadline. So, for example, if you've got your grant writing team and everybody knows that the deadline is September 1st, say the narrative is going to actually be done August 20th, and then we'll have a few more days to review and submit or whatever, rather than waiting. So you're kind of giving yourself the time to not have the uh-oh in terms of the online submission system, or FedEx didn't come on time, or whatever might happen. I hate to harp on that too much, but really, if the foundation deadline is 5 p.m. on Friday and you show up at 5:05, you're going to be heartbroken, and rightfully so if they're not going to accept your application. But if that's what their stated deadline is, there's really no expectation from the foundation that they would bend their rules. So other things to research. What grants has the foundation made in recent years? Definitely want to pay attention to other mission matches that you can see between the two. Did they give to a YMCA the next county over, and that kind of matches your programs, or do they have a real focus on like multi-year projects? What are they looking at? So looking at that list in terms of grant size, grant location, whether they call them out as general operating support or capital support, looking at that list can help give you an idea of whether or not you're on the right track. You want to know who the foundation board members are, and if there's any overlap in terms of relationships between your board members and their board members. And it's not to say that it's all about relationships in terms of your foundation grant revenue, but it can help make a connection, and in a lot of ways it can be a nice point of research for two board members to talk and say, listen, we're thinking about approaching you. Here's what we're thinking about approaching with. Does that seem like it's in line? And so, again, so it's not that you're asking for preferential treatment, but you're trying to just make a connection and have a better understanding and show that you're really taking the time to understand who they are and how and why they give their money. One of the reasons that can be really key is a lot of foundations don't have actual paid staff. So as you're researching, you want to also look and find out whether or not they have staff that you can try and speak with about what you want to propose, maybe some specific questions that you might have about the application format or their take on evaluation and why they've asked some certain questions. Well, if they don't have staff and you can't find any staff listed on the 990 or on their website or their annual report, that board member list is your next stop in terms of research and connection to try and get some one-on-one feedback from a foundation before you are to the point where you spent hours writing a narrative and submitting an application. And again, just to harp on the geographic region, when we get to the top reasons that proposals are denied, applying to a foundation that does not focus on your geographic proposed area is one of the top reasons why foundations deny requests. So if you're in a tri-county area and you're applying to something out of state that only supports, I don't know, maybe I'll say, okay, so again, I'll use my location. So I'm in way upstate New York. I can see Canada from out my office window. So the tri-county area here is a very nice community, but you're not going to see, if you go searching for foundations that say geographic area is New York, when you're searching in these databases, you have to be very careful about whether they mean New York as a state or New York, New York. And you have to pay very careful attention to what they actually mean by their geographic focus, because they'll say New York, and they don't mean the state. They mean just the city. So it would be pointless to apply for support of a local organization here to one of those foundations because their geographic area doesn't meet. Now, that's a very technical little example, but you really want to be careful so you're not wasting, especially your time and your resources, to apply to something where you never even have a chance. Questions on research? No. And I'll say this, I spend hours and hours and hours every week on research for clients. Not just always trying to come up with the next new thing they're going to apply for, but once they say, okay, what about these foundations, to really make sure that it's a good match instead of saying, oh, well, man, they gave $50,000 down the road. We definitely need to hit them up. Doing due diligence in the long run saves you work in terms of writing time and the heartbreak, because really it's not just the person that's doing the writing, but usually program staff end up getting extremely involved in outlining the goals, the objectives, the timelines, and even if it's already outlined before you start, each proposal is just a little bit different and takes a little bit more conversation. So it's about the big picture of the resources that you're going to put into the application that you want to avoid any misdirection by doing your research the best you can ahead of time. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the grant writing process. I like to talk about proactive versus reactive grant making, and I should say proactive versus reactive grant seeking. When I talk about proactive grant seeking, it's not simply the act of going out and asking for grants, rather than waiting for the little foundation down the road to know about you and send you $1,000 every year. When I talk about proactive grant seeking, I'm talking about what sort of plan do you have in place for how you're going to generate your grant revenue for the year? And are you doing more than just responding to open RFPs? So reactive grant seeking would be, oh, look, the Diane Leonard Foundation put out an RFP. We should apply to them. Oh, and the Community Foundation just put one out. Now we should apply to them. And kind of hopping from foundation to foundation, trying to, just respond to the RFPs and the different deadlines that pop up throughout the year. Instead, if you were doing proactive grant seeking for your organization, you would first determine your program priorities. Say, okay, we have 4 core programs for our organization. What's the priority order that we're seeking funding for them this year? Okay, well, maybe program number 1 is fully funded through major donors. All right, so that's not a big grant-seeking priority. But programs 2, 3, and 4, well, geez, our state funding got cut, and so we don't have reimbursement from, say, Medicaid anymore to support that counseling program or whatever the case may be. All right, so for sake of argument, we're going to pick this counseling program from your organization, and we're going to say this is the top priority for the year. So that process might take a while to determine some priorities. But now that you have an order in terms of if an RFP came out, what order would you go down the program list down in terms of what would you pick to apply under? So, okay, now we have this first counseling program as our priority. Before I start looking for funding sources, as a team, we're going to outline what are our goals, what are our objectives, what are our timelines, what's our budget for this program, how much do we need to make it run in a year. And that may seem backwards because, well, geez, how do you know what the foundation is going to want in terms of application materials or what? Well, that's why. So a boilerplate, I'm going to talk in a little bit here about what key proposal elements are. But so you're going to take those key proposal elements and create this boilerplate that then as you identify funders, you're drawing from for your language, for your formatting. But what you're doing is, and this is why it becomes proactive, saying, this is my need as an organization. This is what this program looks like. This is who we are. And what it hopefully keeps from happening as an organization then is if you're reactive, you're answering to what the foundation puts out in an RFP. And you might be changing what your core program actually is in order to try and get the money. And sometimes that's okay, but for the most part, your organization and your board of directors has a mission and a vision and a plan, maybe a formal action plan or strategic plan in place because you believe so strongly in your mission. So if you're doing proactive grant seeking and you develop these goals, objectives, timelines, et cetera, ahead of time, before you even start to look for funders, you know exactly who you are, what you want to propose, and what you're trying to fund. And most importantly, or just as importantly, how much money it is that you need. Because you might start and say, oh, we only need $50,000. We could do the program for $50,000. But as you sit there and you lay out all your expenses and you go, okay, well, salaries and, oh, geez, 20% for fringe benefits and, well, there's mileage. Oh, there's indirect expenses as well for our overhead. All right, so add that on. And, gee, what about volunteer recognition? The more you start to add on, all of a sudden you might go, it's actually $150,000. So you would have been short if you'd only asked for $50,000 and be kind of scrambling to try and figure out what the program looks like at this lower level. So by identifying your full budget ahead of time, you're really setting yourself up for success for that program and ultimately to further your own mission and meet your goals as an organization. So then once you've got the boilerplate set, that's when I then say, okay, where are the funding sources for this program? Who are we going to ask for money? And so you might have a nice research folder that you keep in terms of different sources that are already appropriate but you haven't had to go to before, or you might be starting from scratch. But to then start to say, okay, who makes the most sense to go to first? The right dollar amount, right geographic match, the mission match is there. Oh, and they happen to accept applications on August 1st and December 31st. And so there we go. We'll be able to get right in and have our proposal reviewed. So you're probably going to identify a handful of funding sources. Unless you're a tiny, tiny project, you're normally not going to only ask one foundation for funding for a number of reasons. You need to have multiple sources if you're talking about a larger project because most foundations will not support an entire project. Most foundations now are trying to step away from being a sole funder of a program because then once your grant is over, the sustainability question for that program is huge because they say, well, geez, now you have to replace all my money. Whereas if a foundation comes in and is only 25% of a program, they feel that you have a stronger chance for success in the long run and continuation if they're not the only money for that program. So even if it's diversified through non-grant revenue, foundations usually want to see other committed or pending funds or the fact that you're not trying to raise 100% of your program through them. So lots of things that go into identifying your funding sources. So, all right, so still let's say we're still talking about this counseling program and we've decided that the budget's $150,000. I've looked at my foundations that I've got here on my desk, and I identify the top 5. So now I have to look at those top 5 and say, all right, who's got what deadline? What pieces are they asking for? Are they asking for just a letter of intent? Are they asking for a proposal narrative but in the form of a letter? Or are they asking for maybe a more full proposal with the normal pieces. So lay out your timeline in terms of what your deadlines are, who's asking for what, and start to tailor that initial boilerplate you created earlier in the process. So taking the goals and objectives that you already wrote and then just fitting them into the model and the mold that these foundations have set out. So this part should be relatively easy in the sense that now you're just trying to make things fit their instructions. Do they have a word limit? Do they have a page limit? Do they have a margin requirement, a font size? You just want to make what you already have fit what they're looking for. And you want to be very careful to do that to the letter because especially if you take a boilerplate idea and just kind of replace funder name, funder amount that's being requested, and maybe the date, the foundation can see right through you. They know that that's all you've done. So I'm not proposing taking one boilerplate and just making teeny tiny little changes so that you can send 5 out the door as quickly as possible. Instead, what I'm saying is you take this boilerplate that's a big picture overview of what your program looks like, and then using that, which is the key of what your program is, and then creating your narrative document based on it to meet the exact requirements of the funder. Are there any questions about that, or does that make sense to everybody?
Oh, sounds good.
That
Okay.
sounds good to me, too.
Okay. So then once you've tailored all your boilerplates, then you get to put stamps on it or FedEx it or put it through the online grant submission process, whatever the requirement may be, and get it out the door, and then you get to sit around and twiddle your thumbs for a bit. But I think there's definitely something to be said for keeping grant requests going out the door on an ongoing basis. So if you're reactive in your grant seeking, there's always stuff going out the door because you're always responding to some new RFP. But if you're proactive, just because you've identified your top program priority and put out those maybe top 5 requests, first of all, they probably all won't go out on the same day because it's a process. So you can get the first one out the door and then keep working. But all these foundations have such different timelines in terms of what's going to happen, how soon it's going to be before they can get back to you. I mean, pretty much everybody knows grant funding is not the quick and easy dollar. If your program is in need of money to keep the lights on, grant funding is not the first thing you're going to turn to. Grant funding is definitely what you're looking for in terms of long-term support for a program. Just had a client turn something in that was for 2011 through 2016. You're talking long-term funding. So as you wait for this, you don't want momentum for a program to stop just because there's grant funding pending. So you want to do what you can to kind of help the program team keep moving and to survive the waiting game. Sometimes you never know what's going to happen or how long it's going to take. I had a client literally today that got notice from a foundation that they applied to in March of 2009. No joke. There had been 2 clarification conversations since then, and then the board stopped communicating. Today they got a letter saying that they were getting $20,000. And you're like, well, that's fabulous news. It's a $20,000 Friday. Like, nothing gets better than that. But it's just preparing yourself and the staff for the fact that these foundation response times, unless they're really clearly posted, and often community foundations are one of the ones that will very clearly post it, but it can be all over the map in terms of how long you could hear. It could be 2 weeks, or it could be, in this case, over a year and a half. And you're thinking, well, the good news is that program's still in place, and they're extremely happy to have that designated funding to support their program. But it can be a long wait, and I think everybody, can understand that. But then the decision comes, and life is either cartwheels and sunshine and all sorts of happy things, or everyone's disappointed because it wasn't funded. The good news is if you've done proactive grant seeking, even if the decision comes back and you get a negative response on one, you can kind of loop back up to number 3. Maybe pull out your number 6, 7, and 8 funder off your list, and you're not starting over from scratch because you're still saying this is one of our core programs that we really want to focus on, and here's how we're going to go about it to seek funding continue to seek funding for that program. So that's kind of my take on grant writing processes. And people there's definitely, there's tons of different ways that people do it, but this has definitely been the way that I found is the most successful for organizations in terms of revenue generation with the least bit of angst and the least bit of wasted kind of time spent on unfruitful proposals. Questions? Discussion?
Yeah,
anything?
one question, Diane, for number 2 with the boilerplate proposal. Are there any especially good templates out there to assist in putting together that first boilerplate?
Well, sort of. I'm going to talk in a minute about key proposal elements, sort of the things that make up a really good boilerplate.
Okay.
But that's one of the interesting things. And actually, so the Foundation Directory, the Foundation Center as a whole has some really nice grant writing books that they've put out over the years. And there's a number of other grant writing books, too, and they all kind of follow the same elements. But if you're actually looking for more of there's not really been a form beyond that to follow because they are usually narrative-based. Some grant-making councils, for example, the Council of Michigan Foundations, has an actual common grant application format that they encourage all their foundations to adopt, so all their member foundations. And so then if you happen to be in Michigan, that's a really easy thing that you use as a boilerplate because you know that a majority of the foundations are going to accept something similar to that or have their own application format based on it. But it's kind of one of the downsides that nationally or by other states there's not necessarily a go-to format. So it's a little bit up to interpretation, but I think these elements I'm going to cover in a second are the key ones to always make sure that you've thought about or started to outline at least.
Okay, and actually Colorado has a common grant application format also.
Yeah, and it can definitely, it can be a blessing in a lot of ways because it gives you a good starting point and you know what to expect. I don't know, at least that's always been my experience with them.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So then to talk about these key proposal elements that make up the boilerplate. So there's a number of things that could be asked for by a foundation. And so when I talk about making the boilerplate, I'm not necessarily suggesting that you have all of these elements completed all the way to the end, to the nth degree that they're ready to go. But if nothing else, that you've thought about them and done some outlining. So I'm going to run right down the list here and talk about them each. Stop me at any point if you have questions. So your cover letter is a key proposal element. It should always be on letterhead. Should be a maximum of 1 page. Should always be signed by at least the executive director, if not the board chairperson. Really, the only time, so one of the things, I know I say it's a key proposal element, but you do have to be careful. If a foundation has a specific list that they'll accept, and a cover letter is not one of the things that they will accept, they only want their format and whatever, you're actually better in many cases to not submit something extra if they're that prescribed in terms of what they ask for. So if instead they have an application cover form that requires a signature, so that's how they know that the board is bought in, it has the date, all the contact info, and they say no additional attachments or pieces, you really want to follow that and not even put the cover letter on so that you are following exactly what they've asked of you. Now, if they're not that prescribed, then a cover letter is the perfect way to open. But it's just something you want to keep in mind in terms of following their instructions. Executive summaries. I think everybody knows you usually write your executive summary last because then you're just summarizing what you've already written throughout the rest of the proposal. But usually those would be a half page to 1 page. Your statement of need, again, somewhere usually between a half page to 1 page, depending on page limits. Sometimes you can get away with a lot more space than that if you've got, a 50-page narrative. But what you're trying to do here is really hone in on what are the key statistics to use that make your case for what your program's trying to address, and to be really careful not to make it too personal and anecdotal in terms of the stories. But if you're going to use stories as part of your need expression, then to make sure that they're really tied to the statistics for your particular community. And so the more specific your statistics can be, the better. Instead of talking about an entire state, if you're focusing only on a geographic region, if you can get county-specific statistics or anything, so that you're really honing in on your subject matter and your specific region. Project description is usually the largest part of your narrative. You're talking about your goals. You're talking about measurable objectives, key activities, timelines, evaluation. This is the meat of your proposal for sure. If you come down to restrictions on space and characters or page limits, this is where you'll usually have the most room to write. Or if they've just said you have 10 pages total, and this is what needs to be included, your project description is where you should make sure you spend the majority of your time and length talking about what you're going to do. Project descriptions can often be written using use the benefit of a table, maybe to help use up or to make it easier and ease some of your space restrictions. So if you're talking about the space restrictions you have, but you still want to show goals, objectives, and tie them all together, a nice table that outlines those goals, objectives, and activities all in one big thing instead of trying to narratively write that out can be a great way to do that in a succinct manner that's not going to take up as much space. However, I want to caution against using too many tables or lists within any project description. You still want to use narrative and not get caught up in using too many visuals to help people do it, but you definitely want to make it as easy to read as possible for your reviewer. Key proposal element. If you've done nothing else besides your project description and one other piece, the budget is definitely one of the first key things to do when you're doing boilerplates, so that, like we talked about, so that you know how much it is that you're seeking and what the different elements are that you're seeking money for, that you've got all aspects of the program covered. And even if you want to have the full program budget developed, not just what you're going to ask for, but if it's a $300,000 program, but you have $150,000 in major donor funds, so you're only going to look for $150,000 from grant funds, you still want to have that full $300,000 budget on paper so that when you show a foundation what your project budget is, it's the full number. And then you have your column of your request that's maybe $50,000, so that they understand that they're not the full project support and that they're part of something bigger, and here's what the something bigger looks like. I've seen lots of situations where organizations have only shown the very limited scope of what that foundation is being asked for in terms of what they'll show for a budget. And unless you're explaining how and why this is part of something bigger, like I talked about earlier, so many of the foundations don't want to be 100% of the revenue, so it won't be clear to them by looking at that. And they're not going to usually take the time or have the opportunity to ask you questions like that. So you really want to pay attention to what your budget looks like and how you explain that. So another key proposal element is organizational information. Sometimes that's called out within your project description. If a foundation has a prescribed list and order of where they want to have things included, this is often the place then where you have the opportunity to explain your organizational capacity and your recent successes. And then the last piece narratively that you might get a chance to include is a conclusion. Even if it's not called out, a very short paragraph, just again with what your request is, what it's focused on, is a nice way then to close up your narrative if you've got enough space. Now, I guess one of the questions I have, and to me, I didn't realize when I first started in the foundation world as a program officer, I was often surprised by how many requests would come in without an actual ask. except for maybe on a cover sheet if you had one. But if you didn't require a cover sheet, there were lots of requests that came in without an ask. So I want to put the question out there to you guys. Where do you think that narratively you want to include your actual ask in your proposal?
Usually it's part of the cover letter or it's right up front.
I would agree with that.
Where else would you, is there anywhere else you'd include it besides the cover letter?
Well, it should clearly be in the budget. And wouldn't it be in the executive summary too?
How about the conclusion? Would you put it in there?
There you go. You guys hit on the 4 places. Very good. If you have all 4 of those elements in your proposal, it may seem repetitive, but it should be in all 4. Because you never know which reviewer is going to read which piece or if they'll see all the pieces. And so your cover letter might get separated. Your executive summary is usually what's read, if nothing else, by everybody. The conclusion, if you have one, again, you're just saying, to summarize everything I've just said, here's what we want and here's why we want it. So you want to make sure that that conclusion is clear for them. Those are definitely all the key points. So it might seem a bit repetitive, but you really want to think about making sure that it's clear to them exactly how much, for how many years, and why. And so beating them over the head with it by putting it in a lot of places is actually, that's okay, and it's really in your best interest. Because like I said, these things get separated out, and not all the staff or reviewers are necessarily going to see or read all the things that you have. So kind of a small little thing, but it can be very important. So questions about the proposal elements?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, and I know I went over them. I mean, that was brief, to say the least, in terms of what I had to say about each one. If you're interested in more, like little self-plug, there's my next workshop in this series is all about taking these proposal elements and talking about them in depth. Like the entire 90 minutes is focused on these 8 bullets. So I have so much more to say about these, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to keep things moving. But this is obviously the meat of what you're doing and what you're focusing on with your grant seeking. So I love to say that grant writing is an art and not a science. I think I might actually overuse that phrase, but I really like it. And I think that it's important to remember that you are writing, and so writing then is a personal expression, and so it is a bit of it's an art, and everybody's got a different style. And if you have a grant writing team, if you're fortunate enough to have a team within your organization that does grant writing together, or one that does the main writing, but you have lots of editors, there's always going to be a ton of different opinions on wordsmithing, and well, maybe this particular language would be better than this one, and so because of that situation, I think it's important to always make sure you have one lead person in the organization who gets to make the final decision on editing choices and language choice. But at the same time, even though I say grant writing is an art, not a science, there is a science piece to it, and that's following the instructions that the funder puts out and following them to the letter. Their page limits, their formatting, their deadlines, the whole thing. So even though I say grant writing is an art, not a science, and I love that line, there still is some science to it, but really it's the art of writing. And to remember that a proposal I consider 4 different categories of proposals. Because you can take proposals that are poorly written, there's proposals that are well written, and then, basically what I'm trying to say is you can have something that is well articulated and grammatically correct, but doesn't tell you anything about the program. And then you can have one that grammar might not be perfect, but really draws you a very clear picture of the program. So if I'm a foundation, which one am I going to pick? I'm going to pick the one that describes the program to a T, and then I go, oh, I'm so excited about this program. Their goals and objectives are measurable, and this is so exciting. You know what? It's okay that their grammar wasn't perfect. And they're going to go for that one rather than the one that says, geez, I have no idea what they asked for. I'm just not clear how they're going to, I think they're going to serve 20 youth, but I'm not real sure. And where they have all those questions, but man, that was written perfectly, and they followed all the grammar rules and whatever. So just to kind of keep in mind that your writing doesn't have to be perfect, and everybody's got a different style, but it's about conveying the passion that your organization has for that program and getting that foundation staff person or board member to feel that passion through your narrative and to be as excited as you are and to be like, they get our $20,000. That's it. It goes right there. And that's where the art part comes in, to be able to convey that passion. So let's talk then about why proposals are denied. So maybe this seems obvious, but so the number one reason why foundation proposals are denied is because what's proposed doesn't meet the funder's priorities. And so, again, I've talked about mission match and its importance. If a foundation, even if all they have is the one-lined mission, it's important to go, does this make sense? Do I meet that? If the foundation has gone so far as to say we have two top priorities and they're chimpanzees and, I don't know, youth, and I'm not comparing them because I have children and sometimes they act like monkeys, but I'm really not making a comparison. But so they have two very different priorities, and you're saying, well, let's see, how can I make that fit? If you're asking yourself that question, you don't fit the priorities. And so to step back and not waste your time then as the writer and not their time as the reviewer, because they're just going to kick you out the door. So really take a hard look at it. And if you're the writer and the program staff at the organization are the ones pushing you to say, oh, but they just gave money to so-and-so and whatever, to bring them back to it and say, these are the priorities that they say they'll focus on, and I would encourage us to look somewhere else and to take that stand so that you're best utilizing your resources. So another reason that proposals are denied, and we talked about this, is the geographic area for funding. So the program is not being provided in the geographic area that the foundation focuses on. So just, again, key point to research and make sure that you're very clear on. Third reason why proposals are denied is that they didn't follow the required format. And that's a gimme. I mean, that's such an easy one to follow. It's a shame that you should hopefully ever have anything denied because you didn't follow the format. If they say only 250 words, make sure it's only 250 words. If they say you have to use their cover sheet, make sure it's theirs, not a neighboring foundation's that looks kind of close and you hope it's okay. Then we have reasons 4, 5, and 6. So another top reason is that it's poorly written and difficult to understand. So I know I said that there's these different categories, and I said the grammar might be perfect, but it's difficult to understand. Well, it can also be poorly written and difficult to understand. So they go kind of hand in hand for how it, but you want to make sure that it's really clear to the foundation what it is that you're proposing. You want to avoid using jargon or too many acronyms that's going to confuse and kind of muddle things for the reviewer. You want to keep things basic so that they have a clear understanding, because even if your mission and their mission are similar and you've got that mission match identified and you're really right on with it, they're not going to be experts in what it is that you do. So what you're trying to do is show them you're the expert in what you do. Here's why they want to support what you do, and here's how you're going to do it. So you want to create and generate that passion from them and keep it clear and simple and concise. Another top reason that proposals are denied, if the objectives and the activities that are laid out exceed or maybe are understated, so it can go either way, but this one, so we're talking about exceeding in this case, exceed the budget and timelines for implementation. So if you're proposing to eradicate hunger and you're proposing to do so on a budget of $50,000 for the entire state, and you're going to do it in the next year, most foundations are going to say, man, that's got to be the most optimistic person ever. So again, that's a blown-up example, but just to make the point that, again, you're assuming that there's some mission match. So even though they're not experts in what you do, they have an idea about what you do, and they've funded similar things, so they're going to have an idea of what's an acceptable scope. What you want to be careful about is you don't want to overpromise just to try and improve your proposal. So if you're asking for $50,000 and you feel like, well, we're only going to propose 200 students over the course of the year. But, I think, geez, for that much money, maybe we should say we should do 500. I want to back that truck up and go back to your 200 number, because you don't want to increase just to make the foundation happy or to feel like that's going to increase your chances. You want to be real about what's the best way to have the largest impact on the people you're serving and to meet your goals and objectives within the budget and timelines and all the parameters that are out there for you and for the foundation funding. And then the last one is that there's insufficient evidence that a program could become self-sufficient. So one of the big problems that can happen with grant funding is that a lot of foundations don't like to fund multiple years, but at the same time they like to fund new projects or new expansions of existing projects. And so it can generate then, if you're not being terribly proactive in your grant seeking, it can generate lots of new programs that have a hard time going after the grant funding's over with. So what foundations are looking for is for you to say, okay, we know you're going to support us for 1 year. This is a really exciting program. We're so committed to it that this is what we're going to do after the money's gone to continue it. If you're providing a program that's reimbursable by insurance, that's what we're going to do. We're going to start seeking reimbursement through Medicaid. We've got all our ducks in a row for our counselors to be reimbursable by the insurance companies, and that's how we're going to support 50% of this program at the end of the grant. Or we're going to continue to seek major donor funds, or we've got this new special event which has been growing, and 30% of the proceeds are going to go towards this program every year. But to have some sort of generalized plan in place beyond, well, we're hoping another grant comes in. And sometimes that's the case, but you want to try and be as thoughtful and just clear about it and honest to the foundation as you can, so that they understand what's going to happen afterwards, and that their $50,000 isn't going to be a 1-year drop in the pan and then, whoop, program's gone because the money's gone. Any questions on reasons for denial?
Question, Diane. There are some programs, and I'm thinking of community outreach kind of things, that really aren't going to be self-sustaining, or I don't know how they'll be self-sustaining. How do you address that and be honest yet optimistic?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if you have a community outreach type thing that maybe that the board's committed to, or it's part of your strategic plan, part of your action plan for the year, you're showing that what you're then demonstrating is if you talk about this project in a bigger light and why as a whole the organization's committed to it, you might not have funding, and there might not be a way for it to be self-sufficient through, third-party revenue generation or whatever. But if you're then saying this organization is so committed to this that the board is committed to supporting it with general operating funds after the completion of the grant, that still is an acceptable answer.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
But you want to show, I think it's important to show why it's bigger scale in terms of the organizational vision and mission and what you're trying to do. And that, but again, to say, even if you said, well, we're going to do third-party reimbursement, but we're also committed to supporting with general operating funds, to even just make the statement that the board has thought about it instead of giving just the line, well, we're going to seek additional funds. You see the difference?
Yeah.
But it is, that's a good example. It's tricky. There's not great ways to cost share with clients because you're not serving people directly, maybe through the community outreach, to have revenue generation.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, though. Well, we're on the home stretch here. So just a few more notes about the grant writing process as a whole. So the way that each organization approaches grant writing is definitely different. And so there's lots of, things that I recommend and put out there, some best practices, but that you would probably want to adapt differently within your organization. So hopefully you can take some of the nuggets and apply them to your current process and maybe improve it a little bit and hopefully thereby increase your success percentage. I really think that the team approach to writing and seeking grants is what's most successful in organizations. And again, I don't mean that you have everybody writing, but that you have multiple people that are involved in either the editing or the research aspect, or maybe it's the community outreach through the board members to talk to different foundation board and staff, but that there's multiple people involved, so it's not just one writer in their office kind of going at it alone. It really needs to be integrated into what your program staff is doing, what they're writing out as their strategic plan, and that, heaven forbid, something gets funded that somebody wrote kind of in a vacuum, and all of a sudden you go, oh my goodness, you said we were going to do what? We have to increase our clients served by what percent? Because then you're backpedaling and saying, how are we going to do that? Should we give the money back? Should we not accept the money? The more people that are involved within the organization, the more fluid that grant money will be, and the easier it'll be to manage once it's received. And that really goes to why the overall strategy and programming, if you have an overall strategy, you wouldn't end in disjointed results. That bullet's worded kind of poorly, sorry, but that's the whole point, is the team approach keeps you from being disjointed and all over the place and from having one of those uh-oh moments. Seen it happen. It's like, oh my God, we can't increase by 200% in 1 year. That wasn't a typo, like, you definitely want to be cautious about that, and that's why the more eyes, the better. The more people in the conversation, the better. So here's a few little, I should call them like Diane's grant writing rules to live by. But it's important to pace yourself and to set timelines and always meet deadlines. So if the trick that works for your organization is to set an internal deadline 2 weeks before or 3 weeks before or 4 days before, whatever it is, set out your timeline and meet it so that you're not scrambling and behind the 8 ball, calling a funder, asking them what their FedEx address or acceptance policy is on the weekend or whatever the case may be. You want to edit, and then you want to edit some more. And even though I said it's not necessarily about always being the perfectly worded or the grammatically perfect proposal, you want it to be as clear and concise as possible and as easy to read. So really, the more people that edit, the more people that say, this sentence means I don't get it. The more people that say that to you, that's a great thing, because then you've got a wide range of opinions that have read it, because you don't know who your reviewer will be or how they'll interpret. So the more eyes, the more clear it'll be for everybody. Want to make sure that you follow your funder's instructions to the letter. I think I've harped on that one enough. I think one of my favorite things in terms of how to work on proposals and really utilize that team approach and send it out to lots of folks within the organization for input is to use the Microsoft Track Changes feature so that you can see who said what and in what order. It's hard to read handwriting on the side. Sometimes people like to highlight on their own what they've fixed, but it's nice to have it all in one place and to not have to try and interpret or say, oh, geez, I can't see if that period, did they make that purple? What color is that? Track Changes really takes that issue away and keeps it on the side for you, and just something to keep in mind. Because if you're really doing the team approach, you're going to have so many comments that you'll have papers all over your desk otherwise. And then lastly, even after you hit submit or put the stamp on the envelope, whatever it's going to be, you'll always feel like there's more you could have done. And the good news is, in the proactive world for grant seeking, you'll probably have the next one where you can improve upon that and change the language just a little bit more. But, I think in the long run, if you follow some of these steps that I've outlined in some of the research, you'll see your organization's success percentage climb, and hopefully make for a less painful process for everybody. Normally people say, grant writing, oh my God, and you get like a face. So I don't think grant writing has to be painful at all. In fact, I find that it can be rather enjoyable and a great source of revenue. So that being said, are there any other questions?
No.
Diane, if somebody has a question that occurs to them after today's session, or if they're hearing this in the on-demand recorded format at a different time, is there a way for someone to get in touch with you for a quick question?
Absolutely. I always welcome questions, and I can be reached over email at Diane at dhleonardconsulting.com or via phone at 315-285-5194.
Thank you. And also, you're teaching a follow-on session to this one. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I gave that shameless little self-plug earlier when I was on that very crazy key proposal element slide. Literally the entire next 90-minute session on October 8th is all about key proposal elements and going in like insane levels of depth about executive summaries and need statements and different ways to make for a very clear project description, talking about formatting for budget, etc. So love to have you join us. That's one of my favorites. I call it Mastering the Basics and Beyond. So definitely an in-depth, high-level class.
Wonderful. Well, before we sign off, I want to give anyone who has a last-minute question a chance to get it in. Otherwise, we'll let you go a couple of moments early, just a couple of minutes early, actually. Anyone?
Nothing on my end. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Okay. And Diane, are you all set then for closing the class?
I am. Thank you for participating today. And thank you, Steve,
yes,
for facilitating.
Well, it's been a privilege. It really has. I've learned a great deal, and I'm looking forward to listening again.